So this is it. You're ready to fish in Iceland. You've heard all about how it's this just incredible and epic experience. You maybe have even seen my social media posts because I travel and fish there so often. You go online and do a search and quickly become overwhelmed because there are so many different destinations and species and locations in Iceland to fish. Where do you start? Right here. Use my experience to help plan the perfect fishing trip to Iceland. Stay tuned. Hi, I'm Tim from troutandfeather.com, and yes, I'm addicted to traveling to Iceland. It's like my home away from home. Why is that? Well, Iceland is the land of fire and ice, and I've seen both up close and personal. In the last few years, I visited multiple volcanoes. I've literally been inches away from that slow moving lava. It's just absolutely insane to be that close with a group of people and say, like, I'm by a volcano. It's an active volcano. I see a guy right there cooking a hot dog on lava. This is wild. But this is Iceland. And I've been there in July, absolutely freezing, wearing long underwear, that breathable shirt, my waders, a sweater. And why am I so cold? Because I'm leaning against a glacier. I'm fishing next to a glacier in July. Again, that's Iceland. Everywhere you drive, it seems like there's a waterfall. They are so special and magnificent. And if you've had the opportunity to ever catch a fish under a waterfall and done so, like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I've done it many times. And whenever you catch a fish below a waterfall in Iceland, it's like my trip is complete. And the landscape is like no place on earth. It's like you're on the moon, or it's like you're on the set of The Lord of the Rings. Everywhere you look around, you just want to take a picture and pinch yourself and say, like, can this be real? Yes, it's real. You're in Iceland. And the fishing in Iceland is absolutely special too. That's the main reason why I go there. But there are some different regulations in Iceland that vary from other places where I've fished around the world. And for starters, most of the water is private. What's that mean? Depending on the river or lake you want to fish, you have to book that through the landowner or through an outfitter, because that's the only way you have access. But the good news is, whenever you book through an outfitter or that landowner, more than likely you're going to be the only one on the water that day. But be careful, because there's a lot of tourists that visit Iceland, and the fishing guides know that. So sometimes they're going to tell you, hey, this is the best water to fish in this entire country. Sometimes that's true, sometimes it's not. So how can we sort that out? Well, let's go over some of the regions where I love to fish, and then I'll talk about some of the preferred outfitters that I recommend you using. My favorite place to fish in Iceland is the Highlands. This is just an absolutely special location around 3 hours east of Reykjavik. The Highlands is packed with waterfalls, and you will see them all over the place. And it's also packed with fish. The species you're chasing there are Arctic char and brown trout. The Arctic char tend to be the easier fish of the two to catch. And whenever you catch your first one, you want to just look at that fish for a moment, then turn it upside down and take a peek at that vibrant orange underside. There is nothing like that in the world. I prefer to fly fish, and I use dry flies and nymphs on those Arctic char, occasionally a streamer. But then let's shift gears into that brown trout, which is just like that highlight species to catch when you're in the Highlands. You have to be a little sneakier with the brown trout, but whenever you play your cards right, you can throw a streamer, nymph, or a dry fly. And when they eat, and they will put on a battle too. But there's fish all over Iceland. Why do I love the Highlands? It's the scenery. It almost feels like you're on the moon. In fact, I believe for one of the original Apollo missions, they trained in Iceland because that was the spot on Earth that most replicated what the moon would be like. Plus, because you're a few hours outside of Reykjavik, you're gonna have less tourists. I'm not someone that likes to travel and just be on a tour bus with a bunch of other people. I like to really be on my own. And whenever you're in the Highlands, you really have that river all to yourself with only the group that you're fishing with. If there's only one spot you can fish, get to the Highlands. Iceland is known for its sea run species. What am I talking about here? I'm talking about a fish that you'll catch in the rivers, but is known to run out, live part of its life in the ocean, and then run back in the river to spawn. We're talking about fish like sea run brown trout, sea run Arctic char, and Atlantic salmon. Where do you catch these fish? Well, you basically catch them in rivers that run into the ocean, but not every river is created equal. I've targeted these species of fish primarily in the south and north of Iceland. We're talking a minimum of 4 to 5 hours of a drive outside of Reykjavik. When I'm fishing up north, I'll even hop on a plane from Reykjavik and take it up to Akureyri so I can fish up there. And by the way, I know I'm probably not going to pronounce any of the Icelandic words correctly. Just bear with me. I'm trying my best. So you do have to know what time of the year to fish for those sea run species, because different fish run at different times. Sometimes it's best to be there in April. Other times it's best to be there in September. So it really does vary. I fished on the bookends of the season and done well. In April, I fished in northern Iceland and just had a blast catching these beautiful sea run brown trout and Arctic char. They are such a special fish. Sometimes I've sight fished for them. Other times you're just blind casting, hoping they're somewhere in that pool. But whenever that fish eats and you set the hook and then you land it and you look at it and say, oh my gosh, I just caught the most beautiful sea run brown trout, you are so happy. Also up north, I've hosted trips to chase Atlantic salmon. And typically if you're fishing for Atlantic salmon around the world and you catch like one a week, that's a really good week. Not in Iceland. In Iceland, depending on where you're fishing, the expectation is that you're gonna catch one in the morning and one in the evening. 2 per day, not 1 per week. That changes things, doesn't it? However, keep in mind that whenever you're fishing in Iceland, the Atlantic salmon tend to be a little bit smaller than those larger ones that are known in some of the other countries. So that's something that you have to keep in mind if you're chasing that species. I've also fished for sea run brown trout in the south. I did that in October. My wife and I had an absolute blast. We had a couple really tough days where we weren't catching any fish. It was windy, it was cold, it was miserable. I was questioning, why do we even come to Iceland? Take a look at this fish and you'll know why. And then finally we got to this pool and we knew there was a brown trout in it. My wife Heather was up. She fished this pool. She made some great casts, nothing. Finally, our guide Arnie said, Heather, put on a fly you have confidence in. She thought back to our time fishing for trout in Pennsylvania. So she put on a tiny Euro nymph and made a cast. The next thing you know, she had the fish of a lifetime on and soon landed her first sea run brown trout. It wasn't her last. Keep in mind that if you're gonna be chasing the sea run species in Iceland, that's a very desirable fish and there's a shorter time frame to catch them. Hence, the outfitters tend to charge a little bit more money on those rivers. And what about brown trout? I love to catch brown trout up north. I vividly remember my first brown trout I caught up there. It was on a dry fly, and when I landed the fish, it was absolutely beautiful. You're looking at it right now. I went to get out my camera, and my guy Gilbert looked at me and said, why are you taking your camera out? I said, because I want to get a picture of this fish. And he quickly replied, but Tim, this is a small one. And he wasn't lying. There are rivers in northern Iceland, we're talking about places like the Big Laxa, that are simply known to produce big brown trout. I fished them in April and done well. I fished them in July and done well. I love those rivers, and if you have a chance to fish the rivers of the north for brown trout, absolutely do so. Please pause the video right now and click the like button. By clicking that, that tells me that you enjoy this style of video and you want to see more of these in the future on my channel. Thanks ahead of time. What about the lakes of Iceland? If you look on a map, there are lakes all over that country, and they are also loaded with fish. The most popular lake is called Lake Thingvallavatn, and it is loaded with these ice-age brown trout that are just absolutely spectacular. Some of them can be up to 30 pounds, and you would think for a fish that big, they're going to eat a large meal, right? Not always. Sometimes anglers will catch these on flies as small as a size 16 dry fly. That lake also has a really neat Arctic char in it, and I've caught many of those fishing underneath an indicator. Just love fishing lakes in Iceland. But what I like to share is that I've not always been a lake fly fisher. Whenever I made my first trip to Iceland, I realized just how productive those lakes could be, yet I knew very little about it. So whenever I got back to the United States, I started practicing fishing for trout in as many lakes as I could because I wanted to prep myself for my next trip to Iceland, and it paid off. So if you're into rivers, Iceland has everything you want. However, I encourage you to check out their lakes because they are loaded with fish and they're not utilized a ton by many anglers. Take advantage of that. Next, if you're on a budget, you may want to look into the fishing card of Iceland. What this does is gives you access to a bunch of lakes around the country. Know that many anglers use this fishing card and there's not a lot. Last time I checked, I believe it was under 35 total lakes, though that number could fluctuate. But the benefit is there's not a huge expense there, and then you can now say that you're fishing in Iceland based on the access that card provides. I've never used the fishing card in the past, as I prefer to use outfitters that have access to some of the more premier rivers and lakes. However, it's definitely a way to get you on the water. And finally, where else should you fish in Iceland? wherever you can. What I mean is you don't have to book a 1-week fishing trip that you do nothing but live, eat, and breathe fishing. If you're going to be over there and you have an extra half a day or a day, book a trip. It could be right outside of Reykjavik. Maybe you're traveling with your significant other or a friend and you're driving around the Ring Road. Contact some outfitters somewhere where you're gonna be staying and see if you can book a day to fish. Again, for just even an afternoon or an evening. Which outfitter should you choose? Well, that really depends on a number of factors, like where you're going to fish, the species that you're chasing, and the time of year. So send me an email. It's on the screen right now, tcammisa@gmail.com. Let me know when you're going to be there, what you want to fish for, where you're going to be located, and then I will connect you with my preferred outfitter in that area. But no matter where you are, and for whatever amount of time that you have, get out there and take advantage of everything Iceland has to offer, especially whenever we're talking about the realm of fishing. I want you to catch a brown trout or an Arctic char or one of those sea run species or even an Atlantic salmon, and you have the opportunity when you're over there. So I just shared with you some of my top fishing locations whenever I'm in Iceland. If you're thinking about taking a trip there, I encourage you to check out the travel portion of my website, which is troutandfeather.com/travel. I host multiple fly fishing trips in Iceland every year, especially in the Highlands and up in northern Iceland. Because I bring so many groups, the outfitters give me some of the peak fishing dates and access to some of the best rivers in Iceland. Take advantage of my years of experience and access to these outfitters in Iceland and come on one of these group trips with me. When you're on my website, make sure you sign up for my travel newsletter, so whenever a new trip is released, you'll be the first one to hear about it. So Iceland is like my home away from home, and you know that I fish there on a regular basis. But let's not stop this learning yet. On the screen right now, a playlist should have popped up. Whenever I'm in Iceland, I always make videos about fishing there, and I put all those videos together for a playlist just for you. Click on that playlist, let's keep that fun going. You can thank me later.